On November 17, 1984, at approximately 2:15 p.m., a woman placed a phone call to the FBI field office in Boston, Massachusetts, from a small rental home in West Dennis on Cape Cod. Her name was Barbara Joy Walker. She was 47 years old, and the information she was about to share would dismantle one of the most damaging spy operations in U.S. naval history. She told the agent who answered that her ex-husband, John Anthony Walker, had been selling classified secrets to the Soviet Union for more than 19 years. She said his brother Arthur was involved. She said a man named Jerry, last name possibly Wentworth, was also part of the operation. She said her ex-husband had tried to recruit their daughter Laura, who worked in Army communications. By the time federal agents finished investigating Barbara Walker's allegations 6 months later, her ex-husband, her son, her former brother-in-law, and her ex-husband's closest friend would all be under arrest for espionage. But on that November afternoon, the FBI agent who took her initial call thought she was a drunk, vindictive ex-wife making up stories. The Walkers had lived in Norfolk, Virginia, from 1969 through 1976, a 15-minute drive from the Norfolk Naval Base where John worked as a chief warrant officer in the U.S. Navy. They lived in a 2-story house on a tree-lined street where Navy families made up most of the neighborhood and where children from different households played together in yards while their fathers deployed on submarines and destroyers for months at a time. John and Barbara had married in 1957 after Barbara became pregnant. She was 20 years old. John was 19, and he had enlisted in the Navy 2 years earlier, not out of patriotism, but to avoid a prison sentence for burglary. A judge in Pennsylvania had given him a choice between jail time and military service, and John had chosen the uniform. They had 4 children: Margaret, born in 1958, Laura, born in 1959, Cynthia, born in 1961, and Michael, born in 1962. John advanced through the Navy's communications specialty, earning top-secret cryptographic clearances that gave him access to some of the most sensitive intelligence material in the U.S. military. By 1969, he was a chief warrant officer assigned to the Atlantic Fleet Submarine Force headquarters in Norfolk, where his responsibilities included handling classified communications and cipher equipment. According to neighbors interviewed years later by federal investigators, the Walkers seemed like a typical Navy family navigating the demands of military life. Barbara managed the household during John's deployments. The children attended local schools. There were backyard barbecues in summer and Christmas decorations in December. But there were signs, subtle at first, that something about the family's circumstances didn't align with John Walker's Navy salary. In 1966, John had purchased a bar near Charleston, South Carolina, using borrowed money he couldn't afford to repay. The business failed within a year, leaving him approximately $6,000 in debt. Then, sometime around 1968, the family's financial situation improved dramatically. They moved from a small trailer into a high-end apartment in Norfolk. John bought a red MG sports car. According to Barbara Walker's later testimony, John attributed the sudden solvency to moonlighting and various side businesses, but she remained unconvinced. John and Barbara Walker divorced in 1976, the same year John retired from the Navy after 20 years of service. But in the spring of 1968, that carefully constructed normalcy began to crack. Barbara Walker was looking for household bills in John's desk at their Norfolk home when she found something that didn't belong there. Inside a brown paper grocery bag, tucked behind files in the bottom drawer, were classified documents with naval security markings. According to Barbara Walker's later testimony to federal investigators, she didn't initially understand what she was looking at, only that the documents were stamped with classifications her husband shouldn't have been bringing home from work. She confronted John that evening. He didn't deny it. Instead, he told her he had been photographing classified materials and selling them to the Soviet Union. He said he'd started approximately 6 months earlier, in October 1967, after driving to Washington, D.C., walking into the Soviet embassy, and offering his services as a spy. He said he needed the money to pay off the debt from his failed bar business. He said the Soviets were paying him between $500 and $1,000 per month. What John Walker did next, according to Barbara's later account, was attempt to make her complicit. Within a week of his confession, he took her with him to a dead drop location in the Washington, D.C. area. The procedure was methodical. John drove to a predetermined location in the Maryland or Virginia suburbs, a residential area with little traffic after dark. He parked, waited to ensure no one was watching, then walked to a specific utility pole or tree where he left a small package containing photographed documents. Sometimes he retrieved a package that had been left for him, usually containing cash and instructions for the next delivery. Barbara sat in the car during these exchanges, watching her husband conduct espionage operations with the casual efficiency of someone picking up groceries. The second time Barbara accompanied John on what he called an errand, the operation was more elaborate. According to her testimony, John retrieved a bag from a predetermined location, this time in a wooded area near Washington. Inside was $35,000 in cash, payment for materials he'd been delivering over the previous months. Barbara watched him count the money in the car on the drive back to Norfolk. The financial improvements that followed were immediate and visible. The family moved from their trailer into a significantly nicer apartment. John purchased the red MG. The debt that had been suffocating them for 2 years was suddenly paid off. And Barbara said nothing to anyone. She would later tell investigators that she had considered reporting John multiple times throughout the early 1970s, but had convinced herself that doing so would destroy their children's lives. The children would be questioned, investigated, possibly stigmatized throughout their school years as the family of a Soviet spy. So she remained silent, making her what counterintelligence specialists later classified as a witting accessory, someone who knows about ongoing espionage but chooses not to report it. The contents Barbara Walker had discovered that spring day in 1968 were part of what would become a systematic intelligence operation. What John Walker had been passing to his Soviet handlers since October 1967 represented what Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger would later describe as one of the most damaging security breaches in U.S. naval history. On that first contact in October 1967, Walker had walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington, carrying a radio cipher card, a key list that would allow Soviet cryptographers to decrypt encrypted U.S. Navy communications. He sold it for $1,000 and negotiated an ongoing arrangement. The Soviets would pay him monthly, amounts that ranged from $500 to $1,000, depending on the quality and quantity of material he delivered. Over the next 17 years, according to financial records later reconstructed by federal investigators, John Walker received approximately $1 million in cash payments from the KGB. The material he provided was systematic and comprehensive. Walker photographed classified documents using a small 35mm camera the Soviets had given him during an early meeting. He targeted cryptographic key materials, cipher machine, technical manuals, and operational communications from multiple Navy commands. From his position at the Atlantic Fleet Submarine Force headquarters in Norfolk, he had access to communications affecting submarine operations throughout the Atlantic. Later, when assigned to other duty stations, he photographed materials from the USS Niagara Falls, a supply ship operating in the Vietnam Theater, and from the Naval Training Center in San Diego, where he served as Deputy Director of Communication Schools. According to declassified damage assessments conducted by the CIA and NSA after Walker's arrest, the Soviet Union assigned thousands of intelligence personnel to exploit his material. The cryptographic keys Walker provided allowed Soviet analysts to decrypt more than 1 million U.S. Navy messages between 1968 and 1985. The intelligence gave Moscow insight into American submarine capabilities, surface ship vulnerabilities, and naval operational planning. During the Vietnam War, according to statements from a Soviet handler who later defected, information derived from Walker's deliveries was passed to North Vietnam, potentially compromising B-52 bombing operations and naval strike missions. Throughout the Cold War, the intelligence allowed the Soviet Navy to develop quieter submarines and more effective anti-submarine warfare tactics. But Walker's ambitions extended beyond his own access to classified material. In September 1969, John Walker was assigned as Deputy Director of the Radioman A and B schools at Naval Training Center San Diego, and it was there that he began methodically expanding his espionage operation. Among the students at the communications school was Jerry Alfred Whitworth, a radio man with a top-secret cryptographic clearance who showed aptitude for the technical aspects of Navy communications equipment. Walker cultivated a friendship with Whitworth over the course of several months, assessing his financial vulnerabilities and his attitude toward authority. According to later testimony from both men, Walker recruited Whitworth into the spy ring sometime around 1973, approximately 4 years after their initial meeting. Whitworth, by then a senior chief petty officer assigned to various ships with communications billets, had access to cryptographic materials similar to what Walker himself had been stealing. The arrangement was straightforward. Whitworth would photograph classified documents aboard his assigned vessels and pass the film to Walker during shore meetings. Walker would develop the photographs, deliver them to his Soviet handlers, and split the payment with Whitworth. Whitworth's participation in the operation continued for more than a decade. He served aboard multiple ships, including the aircraft carrier USS Constellation, and consistently provided high-quality intelligence to Walker, who functioned as the middleman between his recruited sources and the KGB. But by 1984, according to FBI records, Whitworth's conscience or fear of discovery had begun troubling him. On May 11, 1984, the FBI field office in San Francisco received an anonymous letter signed Ruas, Somewhere USA. The letter confessed to participation in a Soviet espionage ring for many years and requested immunity in exchange for cooperation. Additional letters followed through August 17, 1984, with increasingly specific details about the operation. The FBI attempted to respond through coded messages placed in the Los Angeles Times classified advertisements, but Rus never made direct contact, and the Bureau was unable to identify him. The letters were filed away, their connection to John Walker unknown. Walker's second major recruitment was his older brother, Arthur James Walker. Arthur had served in the Navy from 1953 through 1973, retiring as a lieutenant commander who had specialized in anti-submarine warfare and served as an instructor at various training commands. After his retirement, Arthur took a position with VSE Corporation, a defense contractor based in Virginia that provided technical services to the Navy. The work gave him continued access to classified materials, though at a lower classification level than what John had accessed during his active duty service. According to the court documents later filed in the case, John recruited Arthur into the spy ring around 1980 after Arthur borrowed money from John for a business venture that subsequently failed. The debt gave John leverage. Arthur, according to his own later testimony, felt obligated to repay his brother and agreed to photograph classified documents he encountered through his contractor work. The recruitment that would prove most devastating to Barbara Walker was one she knew nothing about until after she had already contacted the FBI. In 1976, when John and Barbara divorced, John was awarded custody of their youngest son, Michael Lance Walker. Michael was 14 years old at the time. According to later statements from family members, John spent the next several years grooming Michael for a career in the Navy with the specific intention of creating another source of classified material. Michael enlisted in the Navy in 1982 at age 20 and was trained as a yeoman, a rating that involved administrative work with frequent access to classified documents and message traffic. By 1983, he was assigned to the aircraft carrier USS Nimitz, one of the Navy's most sophisticated nuclear-powered vessels. According to Michael Walker's later testimony, his father recruited him into the spy ring during a shore leave in 1983, explaining the operation and offering him money for photographing classified materials aboard the Nimitz. Michael agreed. Over the next 2 years, he photographed documents in the ship's communication spaces and passed them to his father during port calls or through mail dead drops when the Nimitz was deployed overseas. John Walker's attempts to expand his operation did not stop with his son. According to testimony from his daughter, Laura Walker Snyder, John approached her about espionage while she was serving in the U.S. Army at Fort Polk, Louisiana, working as a secure communications operator with access to Army cryptographic systems. Laura refused. According to her later account to FBI investigators, her father became aggressive when she declined, eventually threatening her ex-husband, Philip Snyder, if she reported him or continued to refuse his recruitment efforts. Laura decided to leave the Army rather than continue facing pressure from her father. She became pregnant, and when John offered to pay for an abortion so she could remain in military service and eventually agree to spy for him, she refused and left the service entirely. Barbara Walker knew about Jerry Whitworth's involvement, according to her later testimony. She had overheard enough conversations between John and Jerry over the years to understand that Jerry was part of the operation. She did not know initially that Arthur had been recruited, and she had no knowledge whatsoever that her son Michael was involved. That fact, her ignorance of Michael's participation, would become the detail that haunted her most after she made her decision to contact the FBI. By 1984, John Walker had constructed what FBI counterintelligence analysts would later characterize as a family enterprise in espionage. But the weakest link in his operation, the one his Soviet handlers had warned him about from the beginning, was the ex-wife who knew about it all. What finally pushed Barbara Walker to make that phone call in November 1984 was a combination of factors that had been building for years. The divorce in 1976 had left Barbara Walker in precarious financial circumstances. John had fought for and won custody of Michael, and the alimony payments he was court-ordered to provide were irregular at best, often months overdue. Barbara moved from Norfolk to Skowhegan, Maine, working various administrative jobs and struggling with alcohol dependency that had been developing since the early 1970s. By 1984, she had relocated again, this time to West Dennis, Massachusetts, on Cape Cod, where she was living with her daughter Cynthia and working at an Eastman Kodak facility. The financial strain was constant. Barbara watched her ex-husband, through occasional updates from their children, continue living well. He owned a detective agency called Confidential Reports and a second business called Electronic Counterspy, which specialized in debugging services. He had a boat. He had a plane. He traveled frequently. And yet, the alimony checks rarely arrived on time, and when Barbara contacted him about the missed payments, John was dismissive. What made the situation unbearable for Barbara was not primarily the money. According to her later testimony, what drove her to finally report John was his persistent attempts to recruit their daughter Laura into his espionage operation. Laura had left the Army in the early 1980s after refusing her father's recruitment efforts and was now living in Buffalo, New York, divorced from Philip Snyder, and fighting for custody of their 4-year-old son. Philip Snyder had learned, either from Laura or through his own investigation, about John Walker's espionage activities. He was using that knowledge as leverage in the custody battle, threatening to report John to federal authorities if Laura sought custody of their child. The threat created an impossible situation for Laura. As long as her father remained free and undetected, Snyder could hold the threat of exposure over her, effectively guaranteeing that she would never see her son. On November 23, 1984, Laura called her mother from Buffalo and pleaded with her to report John to the FBI. According to Barbara Walker's later account, Laura said explicitly that she would never have a relationship with her grandson as long as her father's espionage remained unreported. The choice was clear to Laura. Someone had to turn John in, and it had to be Barbara, because Barbara was the only person who had known about the operation long enough and with enough detail to provide credible information to authorities. Barbara had tried to call the FBI before, according to case files. Multiple times throughout 1984, she had dialed the Boston office, but had either hung up before speaking to anyone or had been too intoxicated to articulate her allegations clearly. After Laura's call on November 23rd, Barbara spent the evening and the following morning considering her options. She believed, based on what she knew, that reporting John would result in arrests for John, Arthur, and Jerry Whitworth. She did not know that Michael was involved. That fact would change everything about her decision, but on November 24th, 1984, she didn't have that information. On November 24th, 1984, the day after Laura's phone call, Barbara Walker dialed the FBI field office in Hyannis, a few miles from her daughter's home in West Dennis. This time, she stayed on the line. The FBI agent who responded to Barbara Walker's call on November 24th was not immediately convinced of her credibility. A special agent from the Hyannis office interviewed Barbara at her daughter's home on November 29th, 1984, 5 days after her initial contact. According to the agent's report, filed with the Boston field office the following week, Barbara appeared to have been drinking when she answered the door. During the 2-hour interview, she consumed what the agent described as a large glass of vodka. She told the agent about her ex-husband's espionage, about accompanying him to dead drops in the Washington area during the late 1960s, about the $35,000 cash payment she had witnessed, about his continued operation of what she believed was an active spy ring. She described techniques that matched known KGB dead drop protocols. She named Arthur Walker and Jerry Whitworth as accomplices. She explained that John had attempted to recruit their daughter Laura, who had refused and left the army to avoid his pressure. The agent noted in his report that Barbara was evasive when asked why she had waited more than 15 years to report the espionage. He noted her alcohol consumption, her financial difficulties, and what he characterized as evident bitterness toward her ex-husband. His assessment, documented in the case file, was that Barbara Walker's allegations appeared to be the product of a combination of substance abuse and marital resentment. He recommended no follow-up investigation. The report was filed in the Boston office's inactive case files. In January 1985, during a routine quarterly review of inactive files, an FBI supervisor noted the Barbara Walker report and recognized that the alleged espionage, if true, would have centered in Norfolk, Virginia, where John Walker had been stationed during his Navy career and where he currently operated his businesses. The supervisor forwarded the report to the Norfolk field office. Joseph R. Wolfinger, special agent in charge of the Norfolk office, reviewed the report and, despite the Boston agent's skepticism, obtained FBI headquarters approval to open a preliminary investigation. On February 25, 1985, Wolfinger assigned the case to Special Agent Robert Hunter. Hunter's first action was to locate and interview Laura Walker Snyder. On March 7, 1985, Hunter traveled to Buffalo, New York, where Laura confirmed every detail her mother had provided. She told Hunter that her father had explicitly tried to recruit her into espionage while she was working in Army communications. She said he had made threats against her ex-husband when she refused. She said she had urged her mother to report him because his activities were preventing her from maintaining custody of her son. Both Barbara Walker and Laura Walker were administered polygraph examinations by Barry Colvert, one of the FBI's senior polygraph examiners. According to Colvert's reports, both women passed without any indication of deception. The examinations, conducted in mid-March 1985, transformed the case from a possibly vindictive allegation into a credible espionage investigation. On March 21, 1985, FBI agents returned to interview Barbara Walker a second time. During this interview, documented in case files later declassified, Barbara provided additional details about the dead drop procedures she had witnessed, including specific locations in Maryland and Virginia. She described how John would receive instructions from his handlers through predetermined signals, how he would photograph documents at home using equipment the Soviets had provided, and how he would clear surveillance before conducting drops. The FBI presented the case to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, the secretive federal court that authorizes electronic surveillance in national security investigations. The court issued warrants for wiretaps on John Walker's home in Norfolk and on 4 separate telephone lines associated with his businesses, confidential reports, and electronic counterspy. The FBI assigned the investigation the classified operational codename Windflyer. For the next 6 months, federal agents monitored John Walker's communications and movements. The surveillance revealed a man who operated 2 businesses as a private investigator, while maintaining what appeared to be an active espionage operation. Walker was cautious in his phone conversations, using coded language, and rarely discussing sensitive matters over telephone lines. But in May 1985, the surveillance teams monitoring his office phones recorded a conversation in which Walker told his staff that he was leaving for the weekend and would return to the office on Monday. He mentioned needing to run an errand that only he could perform. According to FBI affidavits filed later, agents recognized the word errand as Walker's probable reference to a dead drop operation. What followed was one of the most elaborate FBI surveillance operations of the Cold War era. On May 19, 1985, at approximately 12:30 p.m., John Anthony Walker left his Norfolk home in a silver and blue 1985 Chevrolet Astrovan. He had told associates he was driving to Charlotte, North Carolina for the weekend. Instead, according to FBI surveillance logs, he drove north toward Washington, D.C. The FBI deployed multiple surveillance units. Ground teams in unmarked vehicles maintained loose pursuit, while an aircraft piloted by Henry Hank Bolin, a former Marine fighter pilot, tracked Walker's van from above. John Hodges, a former Air Force pilot, served as spotter in the aircraft. Walker's route was deliberately circuitous. He drove through parking lots, made multiple U-turns, and stopped more than 10 times along highways in Virginia and Maryland, behavior consistent with counter-surveillance techniques designed to detect anyone following him. The FBI teams maintained distance, relying heavily on the aircraft to avoid detection. At approximately 8:00 p.m., Walker reached Partnership Road near Poolesville, Maryland, a rural area in Montgomery County. He drove past the location 4 times before finally pulling over near a utility pole. He tossed a brown plastic bag from the driver's side window. The bag landed near the base of the pole. Walker then drove to a nearby location, presumably to check for a signal from his Soviet handler indicating whether the drop had been successful, before proceeding to the Ramada Inn in Rockville, Maryland, where he had reserved a room. FBI agents retrieved the bag within minutes of Walker's departure. Inside were 129 pages of classified documents. The materials had been stolen from the USS Nimitz, the aircraft carrier where Michael Walker was currently assigned. The documents included technical schematics related to Tomahawk cruise missiles, vulnerabilities in the Nimitz's missile defense systems, studies regarding potential sabotage of U.S. spy satellites, and authentication codes used in nuclear weapons launch procedures. A handwritten note accompanied the documents. It apologized for the limited quantity of material and referenced S, later identified as Michael Walker, explaining that his operational schedule and increased security measures prior to the Nimitz's deployment had limited his ability to obtain more documents. Walker drove back to check the drop site. The bag was gone. He returned to the Ramada Inn. At 3:30 a.m. on May 20th, 1985, the hotel phone in Walker's room rang. The front desk clerk told him his van had been struck by another vehicle in the parking lot and suggested he come to the front desk. Walker, suspicious, retrieved a .38 caliber revolver from his luggage and checked the hallway. Finding it empty, he returned to his room and gathered materials he considered incriminating, intending to hide or destroy them. As soon as he stepped into the hallway, 2 FBI agents emerged from an adjoining room with weapons drawn and placed him under arrest. On May 22, 1985, 2 days after John Walker's arrest, the USS Nimitz received a flash message from Norfolk Naval Base while making a port call in Haifa, Israel. The message ordered the immediate arrest of Yeoman Third Class Michael Lance Walker. Naval Investigative Service agents took him into custody aboard the carrier. On May 29, 1985, FBI agents arrested Arthur James Walker at his home in Virginia Beach, Virginia. On June 3, 1985, federal agents arrested Jerry Alfred Whitworth at his home in California. The anonymous RUS letters were connected to Whitworth through handwriting analysis and typewriter forensics conducted after Walker's arrest. John Walker immediately offered to cooperate with federal prosecutors. His motivation, according to case files, was securing a reduced sentence for his son Michael. In late 1985, Walker negotiated a plea agreement. He would provide complete details of his 17-year espionage operation, testify against Jerry Whitworth in exchange for the government's agreement to recommend a lighter sentence for Michael, and plead guilty to conspiracy to commit espionage, unauthorized disclosure of classified information, and acting as an agent of a foreign government. The legal proceedings concluded over the course of 1985 and 1986. John Anthony Walker pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. Michael Lance Walker, benefiting from his father's cooperation agreement, pleaded guilty and received a sentence of 25 years, substantially less than the life sentence he might otherwise have faced. Arthur James Walker was convicted at trial and sentenced to 3 life sentences plus 40 years. Jerry Alfred Whitworth, against whom John Walker testified in detail, was convicted and sentenced to 365 years in federal prison. During the court proceedings, Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger provided testimony regarding the damage Walker's espionage had caused to U.S. national security. According to Weinberger's assessment, presented in classified and unclassified portions to the court, the Soviet Union had made significant gains in naval warfare capabilities that were directly attributable to Walker's intelligence deliveries. The cryptographic materials Walker provided had compromised U.S. submarine operations, surface fleet communications, and strategic planning throughout nearly 2 decades of the Cold War. Michael Walker was released from federal prison in February 2000 after serving 15 years of his sentence. Arthur Walker died in federal prison on July 5, 2014, at age 79. John Walker died in federal prison on August 28, 2014, at age 77, at the Federal Medical Center in Butner, North Carolina. Jerry Whitworth remained incarcerated. Barbara Walker was never charged with any crime due to her cooperation with the investigation. The Walker case prompted immediate changes in Department of Defense security procedures. New regulations reduced the number of personnel with access to classified materials by approximately 10% and mandated more frequent reinvestigations of individuals holding security clearances. But for Barbara Walker, the legal resolution of the case did not resolve her personal crisis. For Barbara Walker, learning that her son Michael had been arrested alongside his father was the moment she would later describe as worse than any outcome she had imagined when she made that phone call to the FBI. According to interviews Barbara gave to investigators in the months following the arrests, she had believed she was reporting John, Arthur, and Jerry Whitworth. She had no knowledge that Michael was involved. When FBI agents informed her on May 22, 1985, that her son had been taken into custody aboard the USS Nimitz, Barbara became, according to the agent's report, nearly hysterical. She repeated multiple times that she would not have contacted the FBI if she had known Michael was part of the operation. That statement, documented in case files and later repeated during Jerry Whitworth's trial when Barbara testified as a prosecution witness, became the defining fact of her post-arrest life. Michael Walker's reaction to his mother's role in his arrest was, according to family members interviewed years later, one of complete bitterness. He blamed Barbara not just for reporting his father, but for destroying what remained of their family. The relationship between mother and son, already strained by the 1976 divorce and John's custody of Michael, was severed entirely. Michael refused contact with Barbara throughout his 15 years of incarceration. Laura Walker Snyder maintained a relationship with her mother, complicated by gratitude and guilt. Laura had been the one who pushed Barbara to make the call, and while her custody situation with her ex-husband Philip Snyder eventually improved after John's arrest eliminated his blackmail leverage, she carried the knowledge that her urging had resulted in her brother's imprisonment. According to later accounts, Laura and Barbara spoke regularly, but rarely discussed the events of 1984 and 1985. Barbara's alcohol dependency, which had been severe before the arrests, worsened throughout the late 1980s. She continued working at Eastman Kodak and remained living in Massachusetts. But according to acquaintances interviewed by journalists writing about the case in the 1990s, she was isolated and struggled with depression. She maintained her position that she had done what she believed was right, given the information she had at the time. She had been trying to protect Laura. She had been trying to stop an espionage operation that was damaging national security. She had not known she was sacrificing her son. The cost of her decision extended beyond her relationship with Michael. According to family accounts, her relationships with her other children remained strained. Margaret and Cynthia, the two daughters who had not been directly involved in the espionage or the decision to report it, maintained limited contact with their mother. Their family having been fractured by events none of them could have controlled or predicted. Barbara Walker never visited John in federal prison. She never wrote to him. When asked in later interviews why she maintained no contact with her ex-husband, she said simply that there was nothing left to say between them. According to interviews conducted with Barbara Walker in the late 1990s, she maintained that she had made the only decision she could have made, given what she knew at the time. She had been trying to save her daughter. She had not known she would be sacrificing her son. The full cost of John Walker's espionage extended beyond his immediate family to the sailors whose lives were put at risk by the information he sold to the Soviet Union. According to declassified damage assessments conducted by the National Security Agency and the Central Intelligence Agency in the years following Walker's arrest, the U.S. government spent more than $1 billion replacing compromised cryptographic equipment and changing cipher systems that Walker had exposed to Soviet intelligence. The assessments concluded that Soviet submarine development had been accelerated by at least 5 years due to technical information Walker provided about U.S. anti-submarine warfare capabilities. During the Vietnam War, according to intelligence analysis, North Vietnamese forces had received advance warning of B-52 bombing campaigns and naval operations based on decrypted communications that originated from Walker's deliveries. The Walker case became a watershed moment in U.S. counterintelligence operations. The FBI used the case in training programs for decades as an example of how family recruitment creates catastrophic security vulnerabilities. The Department of Defense implemented new protocols requiring more frequent background checks and psychological evaluations for personnel with cryptographic clearances. The case appeared in military security awareness training films, including a Department of Defense production titled The Walker Spy Ring: Lessons Learned, that featured interviews with investigators and, eventually, with Michael Walker after his release from prison. In 1990, CBS aired a two-part television movie called Family of Spies, based on the Walker case. Powers Booth portrayed John Walker. The production dramatized Barbara Walker's discovery of the espionage and her eventual decision to contact the FBI. Though, according to family members who reviewed the film, it simplified the complexity of her motivations and the consequences of her actions. The story of John and Barbara Walker is not a simple narrative about right and wrong. It is a story about the calculations people make when faced with impossible choices, about how espionage destroys not just national security, but the families caught in its operation, and about how a single decision made in 1967 at the Soviet Embassy in Washington would ripple through decades, destroying marriages, severing parent-child relationships, and compromising one of the most sophisticated intelligence advantages the United States held during the Cold War. Barbara. Walker made a phone call that stopped one of history's most damaging spy operations. That same phone call resulted in her son's imprisonment and ended any possibility of reconciliation with him. Whether she made the right choice depends entirely on which consequences you weigh more heavily, and both sets of consequences were real.